In this video, I'd like to take a look at Bitwig and how we can go about setting it up, its drum machine in particular, to work best for creating beats. And I often talk about how I will use a drum machine to create an entire track. And you may be wondering why I have Battery up for this tutorial, but Battery has always been my favorite VST for drum machines, but it has issues in integrating with the DAWs that you're using it in to a certain extent, particularly when you're working with the drum editor, the MIDI editor within your DAW. But what I've always loved about Battery is the convenience of it. We can do so much with just this one screen here. So we have our main, and then we have access to effects and modulation, a setup tab, an editor, and our master. So it's a really convenient workflow. We don't have to dive through too many menus, and we can really focus on creating our beat or our track all within one interface. But with Bitwig, we can set up the drum machine that's included with it to work in a similar way. And as I mentioned, there are some issues with Battery when you're using it within your DAW with integration. So for instance, if I were to double click to add a clip here, and then let's double click on our clip to load up the editor. Now you can see within our Battery, I have this baby rattle sample loaded and a kick here, but these do not show up within our editor. They're not named. We only have the pitch names. And also, normally this will take us to the piano roll when we first create a MIDI part or clip within our DAW, double click on it to edit it and manually program our beats. Normally it's going to take us to the piano roll, but typically we'll want to work in the drum editor. So we double click, we're taken to the piano roll, and then when we come to the drum editor, we don't have the names of the samples that we are loaded. We have to manually add those ourselves. So this could be time consuming and inconvenient. So this is just an example of one of the ways where using the included drum machine device within your DAW can make things a lot simpler because the integration is a lot tighter. So let's go ahead and close this out. And again, I particularly want to take a look at how we can set up the drum machine within Bitwig to include effects that we may want to use as they are within Battery or other third-party drum machines. So let's go ahead and Control T to add a track. I'm going to expand that out a bit, and then let's come to our device panel, and I'm going to press B to bring up the pop-up browser, and I'm just going to search for a drum machine that shows up at the top of the list to the right. So I'm going to down arrow and press enter to select that. Now this is the drum machine within Bitwig. If you're not familiar with Bitwig, it looks very simple, and that's actually because it's a container device, and that's really the beauty of it. Our samples are not actually loaded into the drum machine. They're loaded into a sampler device, and we can even trigger third-party VSTs with the drum machine because it's a container device. So each of these, they're called drum chains within Bitwig. You may be used to them being termed as pads or cells, but these actually send MIDI data to the device that's connected to it. So within Bitwig, if you're going to load up a sample, that sample is loaded into a sampler device and then triggered by our drum machine. But again, we could load a VST synth or any other third-party device and attach that to these cells, pads, or the drum chains, as they're called again. So what I want to do is set this up to be a bit more like Battery in that we can load up a drum machine, and instead of it being empty, we can have it set up so that each of these drum chains or cells, pads, are going to have the sampler attached to it and any effects and note effects that we would like to have on it. And I think you'll see how this is going to work and how convenient it's going to be to make the workflow in beat making a lot easier. So the first thing that I'm going to do is come to the first pad and click on the plus, and I want to put a sample on here. So I'm going to type sampler. We can see that up at the top. So I'm going to double click on that. That loads up. Now within our Battery, we had a modulation section, and Bitwig is well known for its modulation. And by default, we're going to have our mod wheel and some expressions here, but I'm going to add a classic LFO in this other field. So we have that here, so I'm going to double click. Now we have our classic LFO that's available to modulate parameters. We also have these pluses where we can add additional LFOs. We can even add an envelope, AHDSR, or any of these other modulators as we'd like to set up for our preset that we're going to create. So that's what we're going to do, is create a preset for our sampler device and then add that to multiple cells. And then we're going to save our drum machine. And this will all make sense. And I think this may not sound exciting, but I think you'll see the beauty of it in just a moment here. So let's go ahead and collapse this panel out. And then the next thing that I'd like to do is add a saturator to our effects chain within the sampler. So we can click on the effects. We now have this green plus, and this is contained within the sampler device. So we'll click on the plus, and I'm going to type in saturator. Let's down arrow, press enter to accept that. We now have our saturator loaded. Now we'll scroll over, come over to the plus, and I'm going to add a bit 8. Let's down arrow, enter to accept that. This is going to be our lo-fi device, the equivalent of our lo-fi device within battery. Let's click on the plus to add a EQ. I'm going to choose the EQ5. I'll double click on that. Let's scroll over. And lastly, I'm going to add a compressor. So I'll type compressor. Let's down arrow, press enter to accept that. So now we have a chain for this sampler for a saturator, our lo-fi bit 8 device, our EQ5, and our compressor. Now the next thing I'm going to do is power off all these devices because we don't want these to be active when we're first working on our beat or our track. So let's power those off, and I'm also going to double click on the headers to collapse all of these. This is just going to make it more convenient to work with. We can see the names of the devices within the headers. So if we don't want to work with the EQ or the lo-fi device here, the bit 8, then that's going to remain collapsed. Anything we'd like to work with, we can just double click to expand that out and power it on. So let's double click again to collapse that. And I'm also going to click on the effects panel here to collapse everything within. Now the next thing I'm going to do is save the sampler device as a preset. So I'm going to click on the header to be sure that that's highlighted, and I can right click and choose to save preset to library. I can also come up to the top, and this button here will allow us to do the same thing. I'm going to call this chain 1, and I'm going to choose the category. I'll select drums, and for the description I'm going to call this drum chain with no note effects, and this is going to make sense in just a moment. So now I'm going to click OK. Now what I'm going to do is add this to the bottom 4 of the drum chains. So now I'm going to type in sampler. Let's down arrow, enter to accept. While this is highlighted, let's click on the folder, and I'm going to type in chain. There's our chain 1. I'll press enter. So now on our second drum chain, we have this that we've created with our effects devices. So we'll go ahead and continue on and add this to the others. Okay, so for our first pads or drum chains, we have the sampler device with our preset. So each one of these has the effects that we added. Now, for me, my workflow, I typically will put my kicks and maybe a bass, an 808 or something on the bottom 4. The next ones I'll add snares, a couple of different snares, maybe some percussion, as well as the row above that. So when we start up with this next row, I'm going to change this up a little bit. And now, of course, you can set this up however you would like, but I just wanted you to see my method, and then you can tailor it for your own needs. So let's go ahead and load the chain 1. Now for this, since I normally add percussion snare on this row and the other one, I would like to add some note effect devices like MIDI echo to give us that MIDI echo effect. So as we saw within the battery on the tab here, we've got MIDI echo and some other articulation things going on. So I'd like to have that available for me when I'm working on my drums within the drum machine here. So let's come over to the right and click on the Note Effects panel. Now let's click on the green plus here. And for this, I'm going to add a Note Repeats. Okay, let's double click on that. That's been loaded up. Let's add a second device, and for that, I'm going to add the Echo. Let's enter to accept that. So now we have 2 Note Effects devices that are available for use. Within this sampler here, I'm going to, as we did before, power these off, double click on the headers, and collapse these, and then collapse our Note Effects panel out. Now, I'm going to save this sampler as a preset as well, but I'm going to call this chain 2. And for the description, I'm going to call this drum chain with note effects. Let's click OK to accept that. And then we're going to add this to, as you can imagine, the other cells or pads or drum chains, whatever you want to call them. Actually, I want to type in chain, and we want to select chain 2, press enter, and again, this has the previous audio effects that we added in the first preset, but this one has our additional note effects as well. So I'm going to continue on and add these to the rest of the drum chains, and we'll be right back in a second. Okay, so now on the first 4 drum chains or pad cells, whatever you'd like to call them, we have the sampler devices that we created and saved as preset the name chain 1. So for each of these, we're going to have the several audio effects devices that we had, and then on the top 2 rows, we have the second preset that we created that's going to have, in addition to the audio effects, a couple of note effects. And again, just set this up however you would like with the note effects and audio effects that you would like. You can even add third-party VSTs, audio effects, or instruments to these if you would like. And the next thing that we'll do is add a couple of effects to the internal returns for the drum machine. On our battery, we have, let's see, on the main page here, we have sends for delay and reverb. So let's go ahead and add some delay and reverb to our drum machine. So coming to the header, we can click on this down facing arrow and we can access our returns. So let's go ahead and add a delay. I'm just going to type in delay, then down arrow, press enter to add the delay plus. Now I'm going to come to the plus and then I will type in reverb and let's add the reverb. So now we have delay and reverb on the internal returns for the drum machine. Let's go ahead and collapse this out. And if I were to say come to the, let's tab and open up the mixer, we can expand out and we can see all of the channels for our different drum chains. Let's go ahead and collapse that. Actually, we'll go ahead and open that back up. And then down at the very bottom, we can see our delay and reverb that we can access here for each of the channels whenever we're doing our mix or working on our beat. Now we'll go ahead and collapse that out and let's tab to come back to our arrange layout. And I'm going to leave the top 4 drum chains empty here just for flexibility because I may want to add a third-party device or instrument to one of these. So just to keep something open here for experimentation when I'm creating my beat or my track, we can add up to 128 different drum chains. So if I scroll through, then we can see and access those or by clicking. But let's come back to the ones that we've set up here. And let's select this bottom one and let's actually click that and just have everything compacted into this clean layout for our drum machine. I'm going to click on the header. Let's come up to the top and we're going to save this as a preset. I'm going to call this prepared chains, and I'm just naming this for the tutorial. For the category, I'm going to choose drums again. We'll go ahead and select this. And then for the description, I'm going to type in drum machine with prepared drum chains. Let's click OK. Now I'm going to press T to come up to our track area and Control T to add a new track. And let's go ahead and type in drum machine, down arrow, press enter to accept that. And now while this is highlighted, I'm going to press B as in boy to bring up our browser and I can type in prepared chains. That comes up as our first result. Let's double click. And this, keep in mind everything that we loaded, this may take a moment for everything to load up. That is finished. So now, just as easy as that, within any project or song that we're working on, we can load up the drum machine, choose the preset that we've created, and for each of these drum chains or pads or cells, they're going to have what we set up, the audio effects. And then for the next row up, we're going to have not only the audio effects, but our note effects as well. So for this one that I have selected, if I were come to the browse samples, I'm going to type in snare. Let's select that first one, press enter. And if I trigger that, we can come to our note effects. Let's double click on the note repeats and activate that. Now when I press and hold, we've got that note repeat and we can adjust the parameters for that. Let's power it off and let's come to our echo, power it on. When I press and release, we now have that echo. And of course, we can adjust these parameters or come to the presets and choose something different. And we are good to go. Let's collapse that out. And something else very cool that the drum machine within Bitwig has that battery does not is this super large view to check out our waveforms. I absolutely love this. We can do things like setting the start and end points for our sample. I went over all of this within a detailed video that covered the sampler device. So if you're interested in learning more about the controls and parameters for the sampler, you can check out the link up above here. We can go ahead and close this back out. And just a couple other final things. For any of these drum chains, we can right click and then choose a different color. We could have done this when we're working on our preset for the drum machine and color coded each of these drum chains to be as we'd like. But for me, I want to make those adjustments when I'm actually working on my beat or my track. But just know by right clicking, you can then adjust the color of these drum chains. Also, by right clicking, we can set up choke targets and groups here. We can now come over to the header and then work with remote controls and set those up and assign them to our external controllers. We also have more modulation available here on the drum machine itself beyond what we set up for the sampler device. But we'll go ahead and hide those panels out. And also, when we loaded these different samplers, they take on the name of the preset by default. But as you notice here, when I loaded the sample in, it's then going to take on the name of the sample. So this is going to be more easily identifiable when we actually load a sample. Let's type in kick, down arrow, enter, and load that in. So now that we've loaded that in, this drum chain is going to take on the kick 1 name to make that better, more easily identifiable. And then again, as I mentioned, we can come up to the top where we left these blank. If I type in Falcon, we can load in third-party VSTs and have those. If you'd like to add that, Falcon would be a bit extreme, right, to add to the drum machine. But I just wanted to show that we can add the third parties like so. And this would apply to our effects area as well. So clicking on the green plus, let's type in Spark Verb, and here by UVI, I can add the third-party reverb to our snare, and this could be added and saved as a preset when you're creating your setup for your own personal use. Okay, so I hope this has been helpful for you, and I hope that you are excited about the possibilities of working with beat making within Bitwig. And I would definitely recommend challenging yourself to, at some point, try to create an entire track within just using the drum machine device. Since we can load in any type of, most types of devices that are included within Bitwig and even third-party devices, it should be a lot easier to do, and it could be a lot of fun. So again, thanks for watching. I hope this has been useful, and I will see you in the next tutorial.